Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I was slightly late arriving here today because my prior engagement was to speak to a room full of economics teachers at the British Library. And I've had a certain passion and enthusiasm for the teaching of economics in British schools ever since I discovered on my second day at work, meeting the marketing director of a then retail chain called Rumbelows, that they'd found in research that the majority of Rumbelows store card customers thought the higher the APR, the better the deal. I think it is always worth reminding ourselves in a group of sophisticated people, that there's a danger, I think, of a widening gulf between our own behaviours and our own perceptions of the world and everybody else's. And it's never a bad thing to remind ourselves of that. But I also believe very passionately that actually the study of economics, and in particular behavioural economics, has a great deal to bring to both the marketing, media, and indeed the technology industries. That actually our understanding of human attitude, our understanding of opinion, has really marched ahead of our understanding of what actually changes the way people act. I also think, and this may not be a commonly held view, that actually our adoption of technology has actually leapt ahead of our understanding of people's understanding of it, use of it, and in many ways our understanding of how people actually react to it. So what I'm predicting, which I again think is slightly an unconventional view, is actually one of the things we're going to see over the next 10 to 15 years is actually a slowdown in technological progress. I know the conventional view is that all these things actually progress at an exponential rate. I don't think that's true. I believe more in punctuated equilibrium in terms of technological progress, bursts of extraordinary change interspersed with periods of relative incremental improvement, but relative stability. And I'm looking forward to that period actually now, because I think what I'd like to see is the discussion starting to move a little away from the obsession with what is technologically possible and towards actually philosophical questions like what's desirable, but also questions like, what is the proper human use and human benefit to be derived from these technologies. And I think a period of relative stability will actually benefit everybody in this business. But my real interest, I think, in economics brings with it quite a useful vocabulary at times. One of the interesting things which I recommend you sort of visit on Wikipedia, maybe this evening or when you get home, is the idea, first I think mentioned or coined by a Glaswegian economist called David Ricardo, the idea of comparative advantage. And comparative advantage proves that actually even if you have two islands, let's say two countries, one island is better both at growing corn and better at making bicycles. Nonetheless, the way to actually maximize the economic value of the whole ecosystem is for the island which has a comparative advantage at bicycle making, by which I mean that whereas it's better at both, it's substantially better at making bicycles. It's better for that island to focus on making bicycles and the other island to focus on growing corn. It's described by one person, I think Joseph Stiglitz, the Nobel Prize winner, as one of the few things in economics which either isn't just blindingly obvious or utterly incomprehensible. And there's a simple mathematical proof of this thing. Now, I think it's a useful concept, the idea of comparative advantage, not just what things are good at, but what they're unusually, remarkably good at. And I think it's a useful concept just to bring to the understanding of digital media. And I think particularly when we look at mobile, because I think mobile and digital are actually very, very good at lots of things. And that caused people in the past, I think, to say, well, therefore, digital media, the web, must therefore destroy all other media, which indeed is what would happen if you didn't understand the concept of comparative advantage. What I think we should start to ask ourselves now is to say, when we look at the media lineup we have available to us, let's actually create an approach to media where every medium plays to its distinctive strengths, to its comparative advantage, not merely what it's good at. And I think, what we're starting to discover, and I think what it took 10 or 15 years for people to discover, is that television still maintains a comparative advantage at certain forms of emotional brand building, at conveying an emotional message, at reaching a mass audience, also at actually just creating fame and buzz. I think there are certain qualities that television advertising has which maybe replicable elsewhere, but nonetheless its comparative advantage of television is exactly that kind of famous, grandstanding, heroic event that gets everybody talking simultaneously. I think the comparative advantage of mobile is an interesting thing to discuss, because I think it's about something often quite different. I think it's about context, I think it's about timeliness, I think it's about actually, the ability to actually engage people in extraordinarily sophisticated dialogue, customization, feedback, customer service. It may, in many cases, its comparative advantage may be much closer to what we think of now conventionally as customer service as what we think of as advertising. Now, I don't know the answer to that question, but I think asking the question of not only what can mobile do, but what is it uniquely and spectacularly good at, is a worthwhile conversation, and it's a really useful concept to actually bring to the understanding of media, that first of all, attention is not actually fungible. It's not actually, you can't substitute reach in one place with an equal amount of reach somewhere else. Different media actually achieve different things, which may ideally be complementary. And so the idea that there's this one currency called reach and audience size, and all you do is you buy it as cheaply as you possibly can, no matter where you get it, I think is fundamentally failing to understand, and to benefit from the rich tapestry of media that we have at our disposal. One thing I won this year, the only Cannes thing I won this year, was actually for mobile, and rather embarrassingly, I won it not for Ogilvy, but for BBDO in New Zealand, who are the people who adopted the idea. It's the impulse saver for Westpac, the New Zealand bank. And I just raised an argument in a TED speech about a year ago saying, how come there are millions of opportunities for impulse spending, but no one's created a mechanism for impulse saving? It's hardly surprising that we have a culture of debt in this country when actually when you want to spend, you can simply wander into a shop and buy a pair of shoes for £200. But if you actually want to save some money, your bank will try and make the experience as boring, tedious, and annoying as imaginably possible. I mean, how many shoe shops would go out of business if they demanded you filled in forms before you bought them, and then waited maybe 5 or 6 days for them to be delivered? So what they've created is an iPhone app which actually just has a large red button on the screen. You set the chosen amount, and every time you press it, it goes ka-ching and moves $20, $50, $5 into your savings account. It means you can save when drunk. Understanding, and this is where I come to with behavioural economics, which is what we've totally failed to understand, is I think we just about understand as marketers that value is subjective, that preference and value is highly subjective. What we probably haven't understood well enough is that it's also contextual. That actually the decision you will take on more or less any issue depends very heavily on when you take that decision. We were recently talking to Transport for London, and I've talked repeatedly to Professor Paul Dolan at the LSE, who's a great expert on behavioural economics and on well-being. He's worked with Daniel Kahneman extensively. And talking to him, one of the things we realised is that your decision to book or not book a Boris bike will vary enormously according to when you actually make the booking. If you can be encouraged to make that booking slightly in advance, what your attention will be focused on is probably quite high-minded things like fitness, environmental air quality, health, and the enjoyment of the open air. Okay? And therefore, if you can provide a price structure or something which incentivizes people to make that decision earlier, it is likely that they will make a more high-minded decision. If those people make the decision at the last minute, what's occupying their attention is something completely different. It's the idea that, shit, I'm running late and it's started to rain. Okay? It's very interesting. This business of where our attention goes and how it's affected by context is fascinating. Most of us have much more high-minded intentions. If you asked anybody now, if you won the lottery in 3 years' time and asked them to write a list and pre-commit, it would be full of donations to the poor and extraordinary generous treatment of their parents. When you actually win the lottery, you tend to just indulge in a drug-fueled binge of total insanity. The decisions we make, the way we value things, and the way we compare things depends very, very heavily on where we are and at what point in our path-dependent decision-making process we are when the intervention occurs. Paul Dolan's great on this. One of the things that you have to be alert to, understanding that business of attention and the fact that because as humans we can only concentrate on one thing at a time, we tend to choose what's quite often quite an arbitrary metric and make the decision around that. Often causes very, very bad decision-making. Those of you familiar with digital cameras will know that for quite a few years, the single comparative metric for a digital camera was how many megapixels did it have. The reason was that was a very, very available numerical thing, which made comparison very, very easy. At the beginning, it was quite a sensible comparative metric. But now, to be absolutely honest, I mean, we've hit the kind of law of diminishing returns, and unless your job is basically working for Kim Jong-il doing his outside posters, 10 megapixels is probably good enough for you. Been a big problem, by the way, in North Korea because they've had to recruit far more people to stand in the stadiums with those little bits of card since they've gone high def. But understanding that one of the great things Dolan says is be very, very careful. One of the worst decisions you might make in your life is to move 20 miles out of town in order to get an extra bedroom on your house. And the reason is that when you're thinking about this new, bigger, extra house you can have, what happens is the new bedroom and the wonderful things you will do with it are very, very high in your consciousness, whereas actually the pain in the ass commute you'll have to endure is very, very low. When you actually move to the new house, the novelty of the new bedroom evaporates almost immediately. In any case, it just gets filled with completely surplus crap, whereas actually your commute continues to be annoying every single day of your life. This is how actually the narrow and peculiar focus of human attention distorts decision-making. But understanding things like that and understanding that there are moments, that actually we don't just have a target audience as advertisers, we have target moments, is something that Google pioneered. So it makes absolute sense for Google to continue this into the mobile space where we not only have a target moment, we also have a target context. What is the context in which I can encourage someone to take a bicycle rather than a car? What is the context in which I might be able to persuade someone to take a train rather than driving? And understanding that, I think, is one of several ways in which mobile enjoys an extraordinary comparative advantage. I think the other way in which we have to realize there's an extraordinarily exciting thing is the possibilities for what you might call on-the-fly customization of things. We saw an early instance of this in what I thought was a brilliant invention which was inadequately promoted, which was The Economist's reinvention of the idea of a magazine subscription, where every Thursday they actually sent you a text telling you what was in the magazine, and you could reply either yes or no, depending on whether you wanted a copy of the magazine that weekend or not. Now, creating that kind of business strikes me, that kind of on-the-fly, transforming the definition of something through the use of mobile strikes me as another really, really exciting possibility. I don't know about you, but there are some weekends when I want to read about the possibilities for electoral reform in Kyrgyzstan, and there's some weekends when I don't. So that ability to actually decide whether or not you wanted The Economist that weekend was, actually a complete reinvention of the notion of subscription, and I think, very, very brilliant. I think the possibilities for airlines, hotels, etc., to engage in similar forms of customization. The potential for yield management, which is another thing which I think is one of those few very, very beautiful ideas which benefits everybody. It benefits the customer, it benefits the business, and it benefits the environment. We were debating yesterday, if you actually told people which of 10 flights to New York was the emptiest flight, would you actually need to drop the price to incentivize people to travel on that flight, or would they actually pay extra to go on a plane that was slightly emptier? Interesting question here, just about customization and yield management. How many people here, when you go to the cinema, like to sit at the end of a row? Perfect. And how many people like to sit in the middle? That ratio of preference has actually appeared through every single audience I've tried it on. It's slightly more to the latter, but there's a number of people like me with very mild claustrophobia who like to sit on the end of a row, prevents us lashing out. And there are other people who actually prefer the view you get in the middle. There's an opportunity for cinemas to actually charge a premium for two completely different and complementary types of thing. That level of being able to actually dial down value to an individual, subjective and contextual level, and for businesses to maximize it, is exciting in business terms. It's also massively exciting in environmental terms, if you think about it, because what you've effectively done is you've generated value, not through the consumption of any extra resources, you still have exactly the same seats you had before, but you've generated value through the better understanding of human individual preference. And it's that business where being able to dial down to human preference, how it differs across individuals, how it differs subjectively, but also how it differs contextually, which strikes me as a very, very interesting area for economic progress. Simply better understanding people moment by moment enables you to serve them better and to provide them with incremental value without necessarily needing to actually deliver any more in terms of tangible service or actual product. And that opportunity for just improving value exchange without actually fundamentally changing anything about the material thing you offer strikes me as the what you might call the economic lodestone of mobile understanding. Understanding simply the business that actually what you value, what you prefer, where your attention sits depends simply on where you are is a wonderful, wonderful thing. One final example I think is beautiful path dependency is grossly underestimated and not really understood in the marketing world, in that most marketing was formulated for conventional FMCG marketing with a model, totally erroneous by the way, where preference translated itself into purchase behavior, pretty much exactly and in that order with nothing else going on. What you see more and more of actually is in complicated decisions like changing your broadband provider or renewing your mobile phone, there is a whole path through which you must carry people in order for the behavioral change to actually fit. Beautiful understanding of path dependency, not in the mobile arena, but similar things can be done like that. One of the great problems that spirits manufacturers have is that even if you take the unlikely decision to buy spirits one week rather than wine, which Brits don't seem to do, by the time you actually get to the spirits within the supermarket, everything else you need to drink spirits, by which I mean lemons, limes, mixers and ice, is bloody miles away and in the opposite direction of travel. There's some very odd things about supermarket layouts. I don't know if you noticed this. Why is it that sugar is put next to baking goods and not next to tea and coffee? Maybe logical. Sugar lumps? Certainly not. But there are some strange things. Now, interestingly, one spirits manufacturer has simply created a cocktail pod. They've effectively changed the choice architecture of buying alcoholic drinks. They created a cocktail pod next to the spirits section of the supermarket, which contains a ruddy great freezer full of bags of ice. It contains lemons, limes, and a selection of mixers. The net effect of this is that spirit sales within those stores overall have gone up by 9%. Now, that's an astounding effect, if you think about it, in terms of actually changing people's drinks habits. And again, it's through understanding path dependency. It's not necessarily about understanding preference. So as we develop just better understanding of human behavior, there's a third and vital thing I'll leave you all on, which is the extent to which actually behavioral change may proceed rather than follow from attitudinal change. We've had a marketing model which assumes that what you do, that attitudinal change is always a necessary and sufficient precursor to getting people to change their behavior. What the new science of human understanding is starting to show is that actually very, very often it works backwards. That if you get people to behave in an environmentally friendly way by making it easy for them to do so, they in turn develop more environmentally friendly attitudes. That generally, one of the great misunderstandings I think that the environmental movement have is that they believe that in order to get people to share my desired behavior, it is first necessary for me to force them to share my attitudes and my motivations, which leads to a lot of social stress as people effectively feel bullied and made guilty by environmental people hectoring at them, and as a result actually become less likely to change their behavior, not more. On the contrary, if you use technology to make the environmental behavior easy, people will do it out of a simple sense of convenience, and then as a result of the action, they will then actually reframe their judgments and their opinions to fit, to avoid the avoidance of cognitive dissonance. Paul Dolan and I came up with a very depressing, but I think Bob Dylan's great phrase is people don't do what they say they believe, they do what's convenient and then they repent. Paul Dolan and I came up with a very depressing, I think, analogy, but it's nonetheless kind of interesting and amusing, which is to say that when a man says, "My wife doesn't understand me," it doesn't mean he's going to have an affair, it means he's already had one. The model of human behavior very much works like this. It is not the case that men sit around going, "I've noticed declining levels of empathy and kindness and comprehension in my wife, so I think it's time perhaps to outsource some sexual services to a lower cost overseas provider," or something like that. Actually, Actually, probably WPP Finance Department probably do think like that, but outside that kind of era, by and large what actually happens is someone gets drunk at a party, they have no issues with their wife at all, they get drunk at a party, end up snogging someone else, and as a desperate attempt to make sense of their incongruous actions, they concoct an entirely bogus case against their wife to provide logical justification for their actions. Now, knowing that human behaviour quite often works like that can avoid an enormous amount of misery, possibly in marriages, but certainly in marketing. In the sense that, at what point, if you actually provide people with a message about environmentalism but do not present them with the means by which they can become more environmentally friendly, in the words of the great copywriter Luck Gossage, who actually created the name Friends of the Earth, he said, all you do is you make them feel guilty and then they hate you for making them feel guilty. Provide people with the means to do things, and actually the attitudes quite often follow. So I think that, in terms of actually avoiding human misery, that understanding that actually people don't have to share your motives to adopt desirable behaviours, I think is a spectacularly useful insight in which mobile will play an absolutely extraordinary part, simply because in terms of making behaviours easy and, easy, immediate, and to some extent, easily impulsively adopted, I think it's a spectacularly powerful tool. One of my great friends, a guy called B.J. Fogg, who's the professor of persuasive technology at Stanford, describes the mobile phone as the single most potent way of actually creating behavioural change over the next 20 to 30 years. I think he's absolutely right. Thank you very much indeed.